In order to understand where we are and how we got here, we need to grapple with history. As I submerge myself in the molecules of the past, attempting to diagnose the condition of this system, I found it difficult to pin down what has actually happened. I reflected on how history was taught to me in school, and I realised that it was severely lacking in substance. It was like standing in the shallow end of a swimming pool and being told that I was in the Atlantic Ocean. There were special occasions where we'd remember anniversaries, but it seemed like we only touched upon a few major events which centered around a handful of people. When we learned about Black History Month, it didn't really extend beyond Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech or the fact that Rosa Parks sat on the back of a bus peacefully. And the little that we did learn about the transatlantic slave trade, we weren't told why it happened, and certainly not the role of the United Kingdom. Today, the world seems to be in complete disarray, and in my journey to get to the bottom of this vast ocean of history, I found myself descending to levels that the sun's light can't even reach. It certainly hasn't been smooth sailing, as much of Africa's recent history is soaked in a lot of pain. Wading through it all has been rather challenging. A novel that illustrates this particularly well is called The Deep by River Solomon, which is about an underwater civilization of mermaids who are descendants of pregnant enslaved Africans that were seen as too much of an inconvenience to be kept aboard slave ships. The Deep takes this tragic historical fact and imagines an alternate reality where Africans were transformed into mermaids and developed a utopia away from the dystopia that Africans above the waters were subjected to. Instead of imploding under the pressure of the deep ocean, the Wajiru people thrived. Their culture exists in an almost permanent state of mindfulness, encouraging their people to be as present as possible and not dwelling too much on the past. Every year, however, they have a remembering ceremony where the historian, keeper of all memories, shares everything with them before taking the memories back for another year. This is seen by most to be a good compromise. They're able to hang on to their history while avoiding the long-term pain of remembering. The trade-off, however, is that the historian has to carry that burden alone for the rest of the year. They have to endure the suffering for the sake of their people. The novel is centered around the historian Yetu, who's finding it increasingly hard to deal with the daily anguish of the past. The disassociation with the present makes it hard to stay tethered to reality. One day, Yetu makes a choice that may fundamentally disrupt the peace that the Wajiru people had known for centuries. And the consequences of holding on to unresolved traumas may or may not lead to an unbridled tsunami of rage. The Deep shows the importance of fiction and how it can be used to reimagine history without rewriting it. The novel was inspired by a song of the same name, written by David Diggs, a member of a band called The Clippings, and they were inspired by Drexciya, an American electronic music duo from Detroit, Michigan. It's like a game of artistic telephone, an open source approach where these slight adjustments in the retellings are a feature, not a bug. The Deep is a work of fiction, which is where these kinds of utopian fantasies work well. But when it comes to analysing our reality, I'd argue that a more scientific approach is preferred. History is not as objective as it seems. The prevailing narrative is usually written by the victors to make themselves look as noble as possible. For instance, the United States celebrates Christopher Columbus Day every year and his voyages into the so-called New World, but the mainstream media barely mentions his atrocities against indigenous people or his role in the slave trade. Our view of the past is also limited by our technological and scientific capacity. For instance, when the theory of evolution was discovered, it reshaped the history of humanity and life in general. It was revealed that the evolution of life is a process, and the assumption that Homo sapiens were static beings entirely separate from the other organisms on this planet was no longer valid from a scientific perspective. A common view of the development of human society is that societal paradigms don't really shift until a five-headed genius who's ahead of their time comes along with a new idea and changes everything. For instance, people like Tesla, Galileo and Da Vinci are all placed into this category. And although they made some important contributions, this view often downplays the contributions of humanity as a whole and the cumulative intelligence that went into a particular breakthrough. I think a more interesting view of history should factor in the society as a whole. If we were to look at the major historical changes, it seems to be tied to what we are able to produce, the mode of production, and the people's relationship to those things. When humans entered the agricultural revolution, surpluses were created for the first time, and that allowed for certain humans to specialize in particular fields, meaning there was a greater division of labor than before. Some people had different relations to the mode of production than others, and consequently led some to have more power than others. This also applies to feudal relations between lord and serf, as well as our current epoch, that of the employee and the boss. In order to transition from one epoch to another, it requires a certain level of development, and over time those quantitative, incremental developments lead to major, qualitative paradigm shifts. This also applies to the natural world as well. Heat up a cup of water, 1 degree at a time, and not much changes except for a gradual rise in temperature. But once you hit 100 degrees, all of a sudden that liquid boils and evaporates. Similarly, in human societies, certain discoveries would not have been made if it weren't for the prerequisite tools, technologies, and insights that already existed from centuries of tinkering around to make things more refined or efficient. Failing to acknowledge this may lead people to believe that the problems that we face today will be solved by the sole ingenuity of the startup entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, as opposed to the thousands of employees that do most of the developing, and all the Africans and people in the global south who mine the resources under inhumane conditions to power this globalized system. Some people, to their credit, may acknowledge that this system was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, which is true, but not much is spoken of the impacts that it had on the African continent as a whole. Walter Rodney contributed a great deal in this regard with his 1972 book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He acknowledged that, like many other places on Earth, Africans were developing before the arrival of Europeans. According to Rodney, a society develops economically as its members increase jointly their capacity for dealing with their environment. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature, science, on the extent to which they put that understanding into practice by devising tools, technology, and on the manner in which work is organized. Some places in Africa were living under primarily communal relations, which meant that the land belonged to the people living on it. For example, a family, or on a slightly larger scale, a clan of people coming together to accommodate each other for various reasons. Things weren't all sunshine and rainbows, but it must be noted that cooperation was usually preferred over competition. On the other hand, there were places that resembled the feudal relations of Europe and Asia, where the mode of production had developed further, such that it required a greater division of labour and specialisation. In other words, African cultures did experience a degree of uneven development across the continent, just like other places in the world. The key thing to recognise is that prior to the transatlantic slave trade, the gap between Africa and Europe wasn't as clear-cut as it is now. Furthermore, when Europeans did arrive, they were pretty impressed by the masonry, metallurgy, quality of fabrics, architecture, and more. And in some cases, they preferred the craftsmanship of Africans than their own goods. It follows that a certain amount of development had to have been present in order to be in a position to specialise to that degree. Africa's development was interrupted, leading to a stagnation of economic development. As Rodney states, the underdevelopment is a product of imperialist and colonialist exploitation. African and Asian societies were developing independently until they were taken over. When that happened, exploitation increased and the export of surplus ensued, depriving the societies of the benefit of their natural resources and labour. This is an integral part of underdevelopment in the contemporary sense. It could also be argued that African development actually regressed, because the knowledge that was acquired, whether it's scientific, mathematical, philosophical, musical, religious or otherwise, was simply forgotten in many cases, erased like footprints on the beach, and replaced by the economic incentives of Europe and America. Just imagine if you were forbidden from practicing a certain skill. After a certain amount of time, that knowledge will fade, and it won't be passed on to the next generation. For centuries, Africans could not reap the rewards of their own labour. They could not develop those incremental changes that would have led to the paradigm shifts that I mentioned earlier. Those leaps were had in the West, where they didn't have to bother as much with hands-on agriculture and instead spent most of the time developing their industries. Even James Watt expressed his gratitude to slave owners who essentially financed his steam engine. In other words, the capital required to develop the West is entangled with the super exploitation and underdevelopment of the global South. And after the colonial era ended, the gap had widened so much so that it would seem to the untrained eye that Africans were backward people who hadn't contributed anything of merit to history. The most pernicious reason for this is that it's some kind of genetic inferiority, the same reasoning that was used to justify the exploitation in the first place. In 2020, this hasn't changed all that much. Africans are still subjected to systemic racism, and in the global south, Africans are still being subjected to the same super exploitation that has been going on for centuries. Justification often given is that Africans have to deal with these conditions until they become as productive as Western nations. But if that were true, Africa would have developed by now, considering the inconceivable amount of labour that has been expelled over the centuries. In addition to this, Africans at home and abroad are often used as shock absorbers for the inherent instability of the system. And even in cases where the Western working class had struggled for better conditions, Rodney claims that the global south often had to carry that burden to ensure that profits could still be made. And at the same time, those concessions tended to pacify those working class people so that they'd stop challenging the underlying contradictions of the system. This is an uncomfortable truth to come to terms with, but I think it's worth considering when trying to fully understand the scale of the problem we face. We live under a global system, and in order to deal with the global problems that we face, global solutions are required. Unless we understand the inner workings of the system and how interconnected the different sectors of the economy really are, everything we do will be at best band-aid solutions and at worst a deepening wound that will cause more complications down the line. Utopian fantasies are fine. The Deep was a very enjoyable novel and provided the temporary escape that I needed while studying the atrocities that Black and Indigenous people had to deal with. However, I also recognise that I have to come back to our present historical moment to be grounded within these material conditions in order to formulate a scientific pathway to a fully automated, post-scarcity sustainable planet. We can't just wait for the elites to have a change of heart, finally addressing the increasing wealth inequality or climate change or even systemic racism. They simply will not budge until the global masses decide that enough is enough. So don't shy away from history. Learn from it. There are valuable lessons to be learned from past successes and failures. And remember, we don't stand on the shoulders of giants, we stand on the shoulders of Gundams that have been operated by billions of people throughout history. Thanks as always for sticking around until the end of the video. As of recording this, we have breached 4,000 subscribers, which is something that I still have a hard time comprehending. So yeah, I appreciate everyone who has commented or liked or subscribed or shared, and a special thank you to all of the patrons who are pledging to this cause, and in particular Christopher Hunter and Tovio Gand, who are pledging on the highest level currently. 2020 has turned out to be one of the strangest years in my lifetime at the very least, but I think we still have to try to be as optimistic as we can, otherwise the likelihood that we will achieve our goals will just continue to diminish. At the end of the day, we don't really have time to be pessimistic. Let's just put it that way. We don't really have time. We have a lot of things that we need to get done, but there's always a silver lining. And one thing that I'm realizing over time is that you have to have something that can continue to inspire you for the future. For me, one of those is just Afrofuturism in general, science fiction, all of that good stuff. But I think everyone has their own thing. Whether it's a hobby or something, and if you don't have that thing yet, I think it's worth trying to find it, so that you have something positive to hold on to in spite of all of the negativity that's looming around us at all times. That's enough rambling from me. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you liked it. If you didn't like it, let me know as well. I'm always looking to improve my content, and yeah, see you in the next one.